Hi, Francis. I think we can start. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the second day of our meeting for 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Before we proceed, we would like to make an announcement. We received information that we lost Dr. Professor Nematullo Sarov. He passed away yesterday after over a month in hospital with the COVID-19. Many colleagues know him for many years as an active participant of the CBD processes since 1990, where he has been representing his country, Tajikistan. I therefore would like us to observe a moment of silence. May his soul rest in peace. Delegates, I'd like to remind you that we have a very tight schedule and that our time together is limited because now we are starting on a second day, and you will see that we need to be as focused as we can. I propose that we proceed as during today's session. We will continue with interventions from the other governments, representatives of the major stakeholder groups and observer organizations on agenda item 5, that is on digital sequence information on genetic resources. After that, we will take up agenda item 4, and that is on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In the interest of time, we have requested the Secretariat to refrain from making a statement on how we could access documents, how we could use microphone that was done yesterday. So if you have a technical problem, please reach out to the Secretariat in the usual way, request support. Please remember to speak slowly. I know sometimes when we give you 3 minutes, some people like to talk like almost running, but then interpreters can't say anything. You're looking at yourself. Talk or speak slowly to allow our interpreters to understand you well enough. And if you could upload your statements prior to making an intervention, that would be much appreciated. Now with that, I would like then to hand over to my co-chair, Basil, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Francis, and good day to all of you. Looking forward to another session. We would like to reopen agenda item 5 where we left it yesterday. And if you remember, we were trying to get the US to take the floor. So I see that the US has its hands up, and I'd like the floor to be provided to the US to deliver their statement. US, you have the floor.
Morning. I tested earlier, so I'm hoping you can hear me and I don't sound like Minnie Mouse. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It is so good to be with you again. The United States welcomes this opportunity to engage on the issue of digital sequence data or genetic sequence data. We share the views of many who spoke yesterday. We remain convinced that open access to data is critical, and any solution must not hinder or constrain research or innovation, nor should any approach jeopardize health or food security. The United States has always believed in and supported benefit sharing, both monetary and non-monetary. We will work with you to find a path that ensures the benefits are shared fairly and equitably. We believe that capacity building is relevant and necessary. Capacity building must be an element of any approach so that all are enabled to make use of DSI. The United States also strongly believes that our path forward must respect Indigenous and local knowledge, and it must strengthen the protection of the rights of the knowledge holders. Colleagues, the United States has much to share in this area, and we stand ready to work with all interested parties and partners to find a path forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I will now move to intervention by representative of major stakeholder group. Each statement will not exceed 4 minutes. First, let me turn to IPLC. Ms. Maya Yolanda Terán Maigua, you have the floor.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Thank you so much. Ali Punja Mashikuna. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I make these comments on behalf of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. Work on DSI has made progress, but needs improvement to meet the needs of IPLCs, women, and youth, as addressed in the following points. 1. DSI must be brought into the post-2020 framework of the Convention to support the third pillar of the Convention and the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. 2. Traditional knowledge is fundamental for implementing the Convention. We disagree with the ATE's conclusion that TK is not part of DSI. Traditional knowledge leads to sequencing, discovery, and innovation. Many genetic resource values, including information, are embodied in genetic sequences through cultivation, breeding, and modification of the environment. Rights for breeds, varieties, biological samples, and derivatives should extend to embody traditional knowledge. Ignoring these essential linkages undermines the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, and the rise of IPLCs. 3. Indigenous peoples view the world as sacred that should be treated with respect as a gift from Mother Earth. This includes genetic material and information. IPLC's worldviews should be included in DSI options. These issues are connected to IPLC's human rights. 4. The IIP supports science that is open and respectful and agrees that scientific research should not unduly hinder it. However, DSI carries risks and benefits. There are risks both in research and in the implementation of results. Open research and applications must be balanced with reasonable limitations, precautionary mechanisms, and safeguards. 5. The IIP believes that a hybrid approach might be acceptable, but must be conditional. Option 1 of full integration with the CBD and Nagoya Protocol, including FPIC and MAT, must be applied for the use of biological samples acquired from IPLC's lands, territories, and waters, or where traditional knowledge is directly accessed. Embodied traditional knowledge clearly exists in genetic materials that are not confined to IPLC's areas, such as through natural gene flow, ex situ collections, migrating species, and shifting species under climate change. Benefit sharing without control over access might be acceptable in some of these cases. IPLCs must be involved in their determination. Multilateral benefit sharing cannot be used to circumvent EGPIC and MAT for identifiable sources of DSI and requires due diligence and monitoring and tracking where feasible. 6. IPLCs need considerable capacity building to provide meaningful input and make informed decisions on DSI. There is a priority need to create culturally appropriate materials to explain DSI to IPLCs and to relevant stakeholders. Researchers also need capacity building on IPLCs' rights, worldviews, and perspectives. Any benefit sharing must be targeted to fulfill needs and aspirations as defined by IPLCs. DSI must be consistent with the framework of living in harmony with nature and the human rights-based approach as affirmed in the framework. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, IPLC. Colleagues, I understand some of our colleagues are having difficulty connecting. I know that technical staff are looking into and we're monitoring the situation. In the Jyoti, do you want to come in or?
No.
Okay.
We are monitoring it, and it should be okay in a few minutes, in 10 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. So let's now move on to women organization. We'll hear from a representative from FARN, the Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales. Please raise your hand. You will have the floor. Secretariat, do you see FARN on the list here? All right, maybe we'll come back to FARN a little bit later. Now let's move on to use, and we'd like to hear from Ursula Tovila. Ursula, please raise your hand. I see Use has raised their hand. Please go ahead.
Gracias, señor Cruz.
Thank you, Chair. Co-Chair, as Global Youth Biodiversity Network, we believe that it is important during the negotiations to take account of the subject of digital sequence information on genetic resources within a broader framework in order to achieve the 3 objectives of the CBD, and in particular the 3rd objective by including DSI within the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing. Therefore, it is also important to address this subject in the post-2020 GBF. Given that both the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol cover genetic resources in tangible and intangible form, the GYBN considers that the concept of DSI, or whichever term is agreed upon, should be taken into account in Article 2 of each of these instruments, as well as in the Article 15 provisions of the CBD, and should be included within the Nagoya Protocol. There are public and private databases that exist where digital genetic sequence information is easily available. The ATEG study mentioned cases where there was access to genetic sequences in databases when this information was not available in a physical or tangible form. These types of situations could have consequences for the principles of the CBD and the ABS mechanism of the Nagoya Protocol, since there is no consideration of the prior informed consent of the provider parties nor IPLCs as holders of these resources and associated traditional knowledge. On the other hand, we consider it's fundamental that DSI is actually important for scientific research. Many areas of research depend on DSI. Unfortunately, we've lost the sound of the speaker. She's come back. So it is important to understand how DSI is used. For the moment, there's accelerated exchange, publication and release of sets of genomic and proteomic data, amongst others. Some of this is being produced by unknown third parties. Given all this, we believe it is relevant to include DSI within the scope of application of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol in particular to ensure that there's benefit sharing, and we need to particularly refer to Article 8, paragraphs B and C of the Nagoya Protocol. Given this, the GYBN encourages fulfillment of provisions that would allow us to have technology transfer and training, and also what has been mentioned, Nagoya Protocol in Articles 80, 22 and 23. These findings remind us that the regulation of access to and exchange of DSI poses a challenge. Therefore, we believe it is important to come up with key principles that should apply to all of the discussions, public policies and actions related to DSI. These key principles include the precautionary mechanisms, safeguards against appropriation of traditional knowledge, ensuring FPIC and the full and effective participation of all holders and custodians of genetic resources and associated TK and involved stakeholders. We underscore the need to ensure that information and capacity development on DSI is provided in an accessible, youth-friendly and culturally appropriate way to facilitate full, effective and informed participation. Also, this information should be broad and pluralistic, draw on different points of view from different sectors, both in the Global South and the Global North. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ursula Tovila. I understand that we will hear the next speaker, CBD Alliance, that will be speaking both for their network and for women. So I will ask Ms. Lim Li Jing to raise her hand to take the floor. Okay, I see. Please give the floor to NGO TWN.
Thank you, Chair. I'm making this statement on behalf of the CBD Alliance and the CBD Women Caucus. The misappropriation of genetic resources through use of DSI is an existential threat to the Convention, as it is actively undermining the CBD's third objective of fair and equitable benefit sharing. Today, highly complex genomes can be sequenced for US $300. Sequences are the size of a USB stick. The Earth Biogenome Project proposes to sequence every species on Earth, and genomic surveillance, the sequencing of a large proportion of the members of a particular species, is becoming a reality. Much of the sequence information that is being generated is placed in so-called open access database that are actually a free-for-all for corporations, or directly placed and hoarded in private data banks. These sequence troves are the source of benefits arising from the use of biodiversity that are dramatically unequally shared. To see the profound inequity, look no further than COVID vaccines. All of the COVID vaccines in use are dependent on DSI and were physically generated directly from pathogen DSI. Yet the vast majority of the benefits are accruing to only a few. COVID vaccine companies are banking billions. Wealthy countries enjoy easy access, while the vast majority of the world suffers greatly. And even though current and future vaccines rely upon global collaboration, that is on the health services of developing countries to collect and provide DSI to the databases used by the companies, national budgets in the Global South strain to pay exorbitant prices. COVID vaccines are the most dramatic example of vast inequity in benefit sharing from DSI, but similarly unfair situations unfold across other industries in agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and industrial processing. A level-headed analysis of technical aspects of how DSI is used, that is, how sequence information is stored, searched, analyzed, and manipulated, offers important lessons. First, fully elaborated track and trace systems for DSI appear to be possible, but are technically complicated and will require significant resources to develop and manage. But if developed countries don't accept their massive benefit sharing responsibilities for DSI, the use of such systems may be unavoidable. Preferable to track and trace built around a bilateral model would be the development of a multilateral benefit sharing system with standard terms and conditions for DSI, with benefits paid into an international fund. Such a system would collect payments for the commercial use of DSI, relying on commitments by parties and the mandatory implementation of benefit sharing terms and conditions by databases on their users. Such a fund should support IPLCs, particularly women, given the correlation between IPLC land rights and relatively intact biodiverse ecosystems. This fund should prioritize IPLC's autonomous development of their own knowledge systems for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Second, DSI encompasses more than gene sequences. The background paper prepared for the ARTEC lays out components of DSI in its Table 4. A logical grouping includes all sequences, assemblies, annotation, gene expression, heritable elements, and amino acids, proteins and their structure that together constitute DSI. That is, the elements of the table labeled A1 through D3. What is not DSI is also clear. Items such as information on ecological relationship and modalities of use, labeled E through I, are not DSI per se. Such information may be traditional knowledge, and the development of a benefit-sharing system for DSI should...
Could you speak slower? The
Yes.
interpreters are having difficulties.
Apologies. The development of a benefit-sharing system for DSI should not co-opt IPLCs and their knowledge, nor force them into any arrangement for their knowledge that is not of their own development and consent. Finding an equitable benefit-sharing solution for DSI has been rightly linked to the adoption of the post-2020 GBF. The CBD should not repeat the mistakes made at the ITP-GRFA, where the lack of a benefit-sharing solution for DSI was a prime contributor to the failure of a 6-year negotiation effort. Negotiation on benefit sharing for DSI should be afforded immediate and in-depth attention and will need to be conducted in person by parties with the participation of CSOs and IPLCs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, CBD Alliance. I think this complete the list of major stakeholders. I do not see anybody from subnational governments with us. So I will go straight by statements by observers, and will take 4 if there is. I see the International Chambers of Commerce raising their hands. ICC, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, co-chairs. The International Chamber of Commerce would just like to reaffirm the business's support for fair and equitable benefit sharing that will support and encourage conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity. Businesses are also committed to working with all stakeholders to identify solutions and to design frameworks that will help countries create more value and obtain more benefits from their genetic resources through research and innovation that contribute to the goals of the CBD and the SDGs. In our view, focusing on a benefit-sharing system, specifically for DSI, is not the best way forward to achieve this and would be ill-advised. We think that parties should be more ambitious in taking this opportunity to review and improve the ABS system as a whole, with the ultimate aim of achieving a comprehensive system that can really deliver on the aims of ABS and create value for society at large. Given the challenges arising from the implementation of ABS to date, we believe that focusing on a specific system for DSI, which would come on top of the current bilateral ABS system, would make an already complex system even more complicated and unworkable for both users and providers. The nature of DNA sequence data and how it is used throughout the world is much more complex than physical genetic resources. There is also a significant risk that a specific benefit-sharing scheme on DSI will result in even more bureaucratic hurdles, greater cost, and less legal certainty, thereby increasing barriers to research, including research that contributes to the goals of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Imposing administrative and other restrictions on DSI also presents the risks of interference with the open access policies for science and innovation and of the major INSDC DNA sequence databases. We strongly support the preservation of open exchange and access to DSI that is in the public domain and welcome the proposal in the Secretariat's note to include in the draft recommendation the recognition that any approach to address DSI should not prevent access to digital sequence information or significantly hinder scientific research and innovation. Business remains committed to working with all parties and stakeholders to contribute its experiences and perspectives to finding a way forward that addresses the needs and expectations of all parties and
ICC,
stakeholders.
could you please wrap up? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I see one more hand up, Biodiversity International. Biodiversity International, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking on behalf of the CGIAR, of which Biodiversity International is one of those centers. In the context of our agricultural research for development activities, CGIAR research programs are increasingly using digital sequence information as a critical component for our conservation research and plant breeding. And it's in that context that we want to underscore that one of the fundamental principles moving forward, looking for ways to address benefit sharing from the use of DSI, DSI really must continue to be available and interoperable and available for research in ways that is not interrupted. It's critical that we have access to and are able to use DSI in our ongoing research. For that reason, we believe that if we go forward, it's important to take a multilateral approach with standardized conditions for access and benefit sharing without the need for negotiation on a case-by-case basis for pick and mat. We note that it's critical in this context to recall, not to forget, that there are a number of other international agreements that are relevant in this context that could be used as the basis for progress going forward, along with the activities under the CBD framework. And here in particular, I want to make reference to the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, with which all of these CGIAR centers have made agreements with the governing body to manage their collections under that framework. And it's under the Plant Treaty, there is a multilateral system for access and benefit sharing, the architecture of which has a great deal of potential for finding a way forward for dealing with DSI. It's in a sense a ready-made architecture that's there for taking forward. We'd like to make sure that is not forgotten and that efforts under this fora are taken into consideration and in coordination with whatever happens under the context of the Plant Treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colleagues, we're experiencing still some challenge with connectivity, so we will take a 15-minute break now, resuming at 7:45 Montreal time, so in 17 minutes. So please bear with us, do not disconnect, and we'll be back with you very shortly. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you for your patience. I'll turn to the Secretariat to see if numbers are up and we can restart our session. Jyoti.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Actually, the numbers are up a lot, and I think a lot of the people who had issues have managed to solve. We've managed to solve, and people are have joined in, and the numbers are climbing. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Colleagues, so returning to agenda item 5, I think we've reached the conclusion of our discussion on agenda item 5 on digital sequence information. We had a very rich discussion and some good suggestion and a number of good suggestions. We heard a number of different views and intervention that some included text change. Therefore, we would like to propose to establish a contact group on this agenda item. The contact group will be led by Ms. Letitia Chiwamulomoni of South Africa and Mr. Gothe Voigt Hansen of Norway. The co-lead for this contact group will be shortly issuing a document that will explain the process they are planning to use during the contact group meeting. This document will also contain draft text reflecting the suggested recommendation contained in the pre-session document prepared by the Secretariat, as well as specific written suggestions already made by some parties in their statement. And all of those are available on the webpage. Other parties will have the opportunity to add to their specific suggestion during the first session of the contact group. The contact group will hold its first meeting on Wednesday, 25 August from 11 a.m. to 1400 or 2 p.m. Montreal time. So I repeat, Wednesday, 25 August, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Montreal time. So I think this complete agenda item 5, and we'll now move to the next agenda item. So, introduction for the agenda item 5. So this is about the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. For this agenda item, Francis and I will, with the help of the Secretariat, have prepared a number of documents for your consideration. Here's the list of the documents we've prepared. Document CBD WG 2020/3/3 contain the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. You see that on the slide. You see that I won't repeat the full reference for the document as they're just the end. Add 1, provide an overview of the proposed headline indicators of the monitoring framework for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Add 2, comprise a glossary for the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Then I assume there is a second slide with the other document. INF2 outline the proposed monitoring approach and headline component and complementary indicators for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. INF3, which contain one-pager on the goals and targets, which is basically all the notes and all the background document that we've been using in drafting and felt was useful to give to you. INF4, comprise marine input into headline indicator. INF5, which contain benefit sharing indicator, access and benefit sharing indicators proposed in the monitoring framework. And document OM 2021-41, synthesis of the workshop on financial sector. document WS 2021-12, which contains the report of the third global thematic dialogue for Indigenous people and local community on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I understand Francis is having some challenge with his internet. I'm very sorry, and I'll continue for the time being, and we'll ask both him and the Secretariat to signal me when I can pass over. Distinguished delegates, we will now like to open the floor for intervention on agenda item 4. Francis, are you able to take it back?
Yeah, Co-Chair, thank you. I don't know why when it's just the time I need to second, then this network begins having issues. But I think we should do it together. And I'm assuming you have now opened the floor to make intervention on this agenda item. If I get problems with the network, I'll let you know, because sometimes I see here that I get the list of speakers coming a bit slower than yours. And at this point in time, I think I see Slovenia, DR Congo. So I'll give the floor to Slovenia, followed by DR Congo.
Thank you very much. The EU and its member states' positions on the first draft of the GBF and the related documents are preliminary and will not prejudge our final positions, as the OAWG3 virtual meeting will be followed by in-person negotiation meetings. We welcome the first draft as a good basis for consultations and further negotiations. For us, the GBF must be ambitious enough to achieve the 2050 vision and effectively respond to the worldwide deterioration of biodiversity. The GBF needs to aim to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030 with strong goals and targets, as well as strengthened implementation, and the ecosystem approach as an overarching principle throughout it. High ambition must go hand in hand with strong implementation. Reinforced implementation, monitoring, reporting, and review mechanisms are a priority for us and should be adequately reflected in the GBF, including national planning through MBSAPs and national reports, which are currently missing. All goals and targets must be backed up by concrete action. Implementation support mechanisms such as resource mobilization, capacity building and development, technical and scientific cooperation and technology transfer are also essential for the success of the implementation. Key elements of these mechanisms should be reflected in the GBF. Mainstreaming is indispensable for the transformative change needed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Therefore, we propose to address mainstreaming throughout the framework, including in goals B and D. The GBF should also reflect the interlinkages between biodiversity loss and climate change, along with the important potential for synergies. Both global emergencies are interdependent, mutually reinforcing, and need to be addressed together. We should build on the strong momentum for nature-based solutions, embedding social and environmental safeguards in their definition. Marine issues, including fisheries, need to be strengthened and adequately covered in the GBF and the monitoring framework, given that seas and oceans are essential for life on Earth, but being increasingly exploited in the last decades. The COVID pandemic continues to affect the lives of billions of people. We need green and just recovery and the move from business as usual to reduce the risk of pandemics of zoonotic origin. Therefore, the GBF needs to trigger changes to exploitation, trade, and consumption patterns that threaten the health of ecosystems and people. Hence, it is essential to include holistic approaches such as the One Health approach. Sustainable use of biodiversity components should be operationalized in relevant milestones and targets. We recognize the contribution of IPLCs to the conservation and sustainable use of ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. We stress the need to include this aspect adequately in the GBF and the implementation of several targets. Also, gender issues need to be better integrated throughout the framework. We generally support the structure of outcome-oriented 2050 goals, 2030 milestones, and action-oriented targets. However, some of the milestones for goals B and D overlap with some of the targets, and this should be resolved. As regards Goal A and its related milestones and targets, we have suggestions for making them more precise and measurable, and to raise the level of ambition for some elements. For example, increase in the integrity and connectivity of all key ecosystems, decrease in extinction rate and risk, amount of genetic diversity maintained. We broadly support Goal B and related milestones and targets. It is very important to address the delivery and evaluation of ecosystem services as the benefits of conservation, restoration, and sustainable use measures. For us, this is closely linked to an urgent need to reduce our ecological footprint. We appreciate the improvements concerning the benefit sharing goal and targets. However, several challenges remain, especially measurability. The EU and its member states support a goal addressing means of implementation broadly and equally to close the gap, including through an increased financial flow and a strong target on eliminating harmful incentives. We need to strike the right balance between keeping goals and targets short and communicable, and at the same time covering all relevant elements and being as smart as possible. This is challenging, and we will continue to look for solutions. We further consider the glossary and so-called one-pagers important elements for such an approach, but they need to be updated and further complemented. The monitoring framework is a critical part of the GBF. The goals, targets, and indicators must be coherent and adopted together to provide clarity for parties and others for reporting on progress. A robust and clear set of indicators will strengthen the goals and targets. Finally, we are willing to contribute constructively and positively to the work of the OAWG and next meetings to adopt an ambitious post-2020 GBF for the benefit of the planet and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Slovenia. Unfortunately, Francis' connection is not so great, so I'll take over. I see the Democratic Republic of Congo on behalf of the Africa region. République démocratique du Congo, vous avez la parole.
Democratic Republic of Congo, you have the floor.
On peut vous entendre?
Oui, oui. Merci.
We can hear you now. Yes, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Statement on behalf of the Africa region. The Democratic Republic of Congo read the statement on behalf of the African. Africa is the post-2020 global biodiversity framework as a solution to the global challenge of unprecedented biodiversity loss. It is essential to retain global nature assets and biodiversity and to assure the food and livelihood security of current and future generations. The uncertainty about the outbreak of the COVID-19 have caused so many disruptions, but with able leadership from our co-chairs, the wonderful support from the Secretariat, commitment from parties, and other holders, we manage against all odds to progress to this version of the post-2020 global biodiversity, I will call the first draft. Much work has been done, but we still have a long way to go in finalizing the GBF. In its current structure, the framework should strive to reflect a strong relation between its various elements in order to allow easy reporting on how each component contributes toward achieving the goals and the ultimate 2050 vision. This linkage needs to be established now during the planning phase in order to ensure ease of implementation and reporting. There should also be a balance on how the JBF address the three objectives of the convention. Mr. Co-Chair, we have always been advocating for an all of society all of government approach to enhance successful implementation of the convention and the post-2020 JBF process present an excellent opportunity to reinforce that. We therefore for the following considerations. One, simplification of the structure of the JBF by aligning each different element accordingly for all the members of the society to understand how everything adds up together in achieving the 2050 vision. Two, simplification of the language used to avoid ambiguity and loss of the intent meaning in different interpretations. Three, most targets are more process-oriented than outcome-oriented. Example, use of words such as ensure. We will provide the proposal to rephrase them as appropriate during the contact group. 4. Most targets are not smart, and it will be quite challenging to report progress on them. A review of the language used and introduction of the numerical aspect may assist in improving their targets, noting that only 9 of the 21 targets have demonstrated to some extent a numerical value. We will provide this in writing. 5. Ecosystem restoration is very important to Africa, with strong political support from our ministers of environment. Through UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, we believe the JBF will place more emphasis on restoration and on sustainable, integrated, participatory management of all ecosystems. 6. Africa places the importance of resource mobilization that is commensurate with the level of ambition of the JBF and in place by the time the JBF is adopted. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci. La République démocratique du Congo.
Thank you, DRC.
Pass to Argentina on behalf of GRULAC. Argentina, tienes la palabra.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair.
Of Latin American and Caribbean countries. First of all, we would like to thank the Secretariat and Colombia for their work in the organization of the third meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Mr. Co-Chair, we have before our eyes a new version of the GBF that will be subject to further development. We recognize the progress in this first draft, but we consider there is still a long way to reach consensus. Therefore, our region has come to this meeting ready to engage in meaningful discussions, willing to make substantial progress in an inclusive and transparent manner. In order to move forward, we would like to make 4 specific comments on the current version of the draft and that we will discuss in this meeting. Firstly, we want to reach a common understanding for a solid structure of the GBF. As a region, we believe there is still need for several improvements. We have to work hard to make the framework more streamlined, simple, and communicable, including more clarity on the scope of certain terms, concepts, and references. In order to achieve this, we suggest improving the wording of goals so that they are aspirational and consistent with each other, the deletion of milestones and merging of their relevant aspects with the targets as appropriate, the revision of the theory of change, and the strengthening of the alignment between goals and targets. Secondly, our region is full of opportunities to implement the CBD. We are custodians of great diversity of biological resources, a center of origin and genetic diversification of species necessary for food security, health, and the creation of value-added products. We provide a wide range of ecosystem functions and services that help us address different social, economic, and environmental challenges, and we are home of a great variety of cultures and traditional knowledge. We are committed to halting the loss of biological diversity, and we really expect this framework to address the three objectives of the Convention in a balanced manner. In this regard, we will be making several proposals regarding the conservation of biodiversity, its sustainable use, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources. As a region, we understand in particular that sustainable use and ABS are of utmost importance and need to be better reflected in the GBF. Thirdly, as a region that faces many environmental, social, and economic challenges, which have worsened due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, we expect this framework to contribute to a sustainable and inclusive recovery. We have to address the challenge to conserve and sustainably use our wild and domesticated biodiversity, to promote sustainable production and consumption patterns, to strengthen elements around sustainable value chain and sustainable agriculture, to foster innovation, to mainstream biodiversity in all sectors and levels, to enhance environmental awareness, and to educate for intergenerational equity. In other words, we need a biodiversity framework in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and in synergy with the Rio Conventions and other conventions related to biodiversity. Finally, as we face a second year of pandemic, the developing world suffers from an unprecedented scarcity of resources for implementation. Now, more than ever, there is need for a strong global framework to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity, along with a real commitment to provide resources to meet the incremental cost and technical needs of developing countries to implement such framework in line with Article 20 and the Rio Principles. The access to adequate and sufficient resources has always been a critical challenge for our region to effectively implement CBD. This is one of the main amendments that needs to be made if we want to actually halt the current biodiversity crisis. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has widened the inequalities between developed and developing countries, thus highlighting the importance of assuring access to technology transfer, capacity building, and technical cooperation, and achieving the full implementation of Articles 16 and 18 of the Convention. We should also strive to engage the private sector as appropriate to mobilize new and additional resources to reverse biodiversity loss. Dear co-chairs, with less than 8 months left until the second phase of COP15, we're still in the middle of the pandemic and entering uncharted territory. We need all parties on board, with the participation of all relevant stakeholders, including IPLCs, civil society, academia, and the private and financial sectors. We expect that during these upcoming days, we will find our way forward so that we can deliver an ambitious, realistic, and balanced framework at COP15 in order to fulfill the 2050 vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Argentina. We will now give the floor to Georgia, who will speak on behalf of Central and Eastern Europe region, and we kindly ask Georgia if they could post their statement on the statement website. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
On behalf of the Central and Eastern European region, I would like to thank the co-chairs of the process for the excellent work undertaken and preparation of the first draft of the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework. We consider the document as a considerable step forward in this process. We would also like to emphasize that the framework should not fall short of the necessary ambition. At the same time, we would like to express our concerns on several general issues. We still consider it difficult to understand the structure of the framework, considering that the action targets are not tied to the goals. Without proper communication, this may cause misunderstanding among the society. Speaking of the whole society, we would also like to mention that the sustainable production and consumption should be the most important issue under the framework. We would also like to highlight that the MB-subs are the main tool for the implementation of the convention, also considering the sub-regional commitments within the Green Agenda for Western Balkan within the CE region. Therefore, this should be appropriately recognized in the framework. The draft contains the targets related to the tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. However, it is assumed that these aspects, such as resource mobilization, mainstreaming, and others, will be addressed through relevant decisions. We are concerned that without stronger emphasis in the framework, these decisions will face significant challenges in implementation. We also note that the terms are not clear enough, giving options for different interpretations. Therefore, glossary needs significant improvement. We would once again express our concerns on headline indicators. In many cases, the data at the national level is non-existent. Therefore, even though it may be possible to disaggregate global data to the national level, this will require significant capacity development for the countries. At the same time, we would like to note that the data collection at the national level would produce more accurate data. We also lack the issues related to awareness raising. We consider this as an important tool to support implementation, especially considering that the framework is supposed to be the whole of society document. We would also highlight the importance of synergies with biodiversity related as well as other multilateral environmental agreements. This is probably especially important for other MEAs since their involvement in the biodiversity processes is much more limited. This is important to assure that we mutually support the achievement of our goals. Finally, once again, we would like to emphasize the importance of resource mobilization for the region. Here, we would like to note that the target 19 speaks only about the developing countries. While it is important to use the standard terminology everywhere in the texts, phrase for the eligible countries, namely developing countries, in particular least developed countries and small island developing countries, as well as the countries with economies in transition. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Georgia. I do not see any further requests for regional statements. So I will see, Francis, are you able to act the sharing of this session?
It's fine. If it goes off, then you can always come, no problem. Let me see now. I think we can now go to I see citizen noted. Jyoti, I see you noted. Jyoti, can you hear me?
Francis, it's very difficult to hear you, so If you don't mind, maybe the best is for me to continue. I apologize to intervention by parties. If you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list. When I give you the floor, your microphone will be activated. The status bar will turn red on your computer, and you may start to speak at that time. So let's start. I see a number of you have already raised their hand. I will start by New Zealand, followed by Japan and Indonesia. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. New Zealand welcomes the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and commends the co-chair's efforts to reflect feedback to date. In particular, we welcome the greater acknowledgement of the importance of biodiversity to Indigenous peoples and the important role Indigenous peoples and their traditional knowledge play in the sustainable management and protection of biodiversity. We see some areas where this can be further strengthened. For example, in Target 3, New Zealand considers any protected areas target should also recognise the need to give effect to the rights of Indigenous peoples. We also believe the rights of Indigenous peoples should be highlighted in the decision text. We propose a new paragraph after existing paragraph 9 as follows. Reiterates its expectation that parties and other governments will ensure that the rights of Indigenous peoples are given effect to in the implementation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We have two other areas of comment. Firstly, the timely implementation of the framework will be key to its success. We therefore suggest that the decision is worded to inspire an immediate and strong response. The decision could encourage parties to bring the framework to life by communicating the new or enhanced actions towards each of the global goals and targets, preparing an updated NBSAP or a standalone submission containing national actions which reflect each of the goals and targets, or other actions commensurate with the urgency and ambition needed to halt and reverse the global loss of biodiversity. The decision should also emphasise the importance of implementation actions by non-state entities. Secondly, we would like to see the framework embody a specific, inspirational goal for nature along the lines of the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree or net zero by 2050 goals. This goal could include clear and measurable elements such as zero net loss of nature from 2020, net positive by 2030, and full recovery by 2050 for the benefit of all people and life on Earth. New Zealand proposes specific text edits to the draft decision to reflect these points, and we will submit full drafting suggestions to the Secretariat in writing. New Zealand looks forward to constructive discussions with all parties over the coming 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. I will now give the floor to Japan, followed by Indonesia, and then Korea. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. First of all, Japan is grateful for the tremendous efforts made by the co-chairs and the CBD Secretariat in preparing this new draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Japan acknowledged some progress made in developing the draft framework, such as adding quantitative elements and deleting duplications among different targets. To support ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we agree with the idea of mobilizing resources from all resources, being commensurate with our aspirations. However, we need to confirm the feasibility, rationale, and the need for related quantitative targets. Furthermore, we are concerned that the goal and target related to access and benefit sharing only refer to pursuing an increase in shared benefits without establishing any clear links to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Therefore, they need to be revised so that it becomes visible that access and benefit sharing contributes to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Japan also welcomes the limited number of headline indicators from the standpoint of our respective national reporting. However, it is also unclear if all the targets necessarily require corresponding headline indicators, respectively. As noted earlier, we believe that the period between 2011 and 2020 should be used as the reference period for monitoring using the new indicators. However, we find it's inappropriate to use the pre-industrial period for the monitoring of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, since we may not be able to adequately evaluate the progress in this decade in such a long time frame. Lastly, the COP decision for 14/34 shows the principles that the preparatory process for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework should be participatory and inclusive. However, participants from the Asia-Pacific region are joining the discussion in a challenging situation. Therefore, we would like to point out the need for improvement regarding the time zone issue so that the participants from all the regions will have an equal opportunity. We will submit our statement along with specific text edits in writing and look forward to further detailed discussion on this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Japan. I will now give the floor to Indonesia, followed by Korea and Malaysia. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia believes that a transformative strategy is urgently needed to halt biodiversity loss and achieve the 2050 vision of biodiversity. However, Indonesia views that the draft target and indicator elements set in post-2020 GBF create an unfair playing field to countries, taking into account their different conditions and capabilities. To address this unfair situation, Indonesia proposes that the quantitative target should be realistic and consider the need of developing countries for development while minimizing its impact on biodiversity. Indonesia emphasizes equal partnership to share the responsibility for achieving biodiversity target and technological development between developed and developing countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the global target of post-2020 GBS should be designed with flexible frameworks that are adjustable to the condition and capabilities of each country in meeting thereof. Furthermore, the global target of post-2020 GBF should also be able to balance the objective of CBD and their means of implementation. Given the ongoing global pandemic, Indonesia highlights the importance of ensuring that all proposed targets and indicators on the minimum target can be revised and reassessed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Indonesia congratulates the Secretariat for preparing the new document of the post-2020. However, Indonesia seeks clarification on the status of all OEWG document that the first draft of the post-2020 GBF, in which bracketed provisions have been unbracketed, particularly the unbracketed of the proposed quantitative target. We believe that we can always reopen negotiation for quantitative target proposals. In addition, the quality of biodiversity needs to be linked to the effectiveness of management and not only reflected in the achievement of the agreed target. Last but not least, regarding point 6 of the appendix of document 3, Indonesia emphasizes the importance of, among others, Technology transfer, easy access to new technologies from developed countries to developing countries, research cooperation, training and capacity building, technological development through cooperation, and financial support. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the successful implementation of global targets depend on the participation of all countries. Thus, Indonesia would like to reiterate the importance of considering all countries' different conditions and capabilities in meeting the target. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Indonesia. Just been informed that we need to take a break at 8:45 for 15 minutes for the interpreter, and that the session will be extended by at least 10 minutes at the end. So let's continue on with parties, and just to let you know that we'll break at some point. So I would like now to give the floor to Korea, followed by Malaysia and Bhutan. Korea, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. The Republic of Korea welcomes the first draft of Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and thanks the Co-Chair and Secretariat for their effort. The first draft, with more specific and detailed goals and targets, will serve as a great foundation for the future GBF negotiations. Korea would like to suggest some brief opinions before presenting detailed comment on goals and targets in the contact group. First, a logical and systematic linkage should be ensured between goals, milestones, and targets. It means scientific evidence and logical proofs are required to answer how the achievement of targets will affect the 2030 milestones and 2050 goals, and how they can contribute to achieving 2050 visions as a result. Second, for all goals, milestones, and targets, we should consider numeric targets. In addition, all negotiations about numeric targets must take into account the feasibility, measurability, and cooperation measures to narrow the gaps in implementation capacity among parties. Third, we need to prepare headline indicators as soon as possible in relation to the existing indicators. Many countries, including Korea, have already begun to revise their MBSAPs considering the delayed schedule to adopt GBF. Since achieving 2030 goals require quick revision of MBSAPs, Korea hopes we will establish headline indicators before COP15. Moreover, other component indicators and complementary indicators should be developed in speed manner so that we can measure the achievement of goals and targets. Lastly, although it is critical for GBF to contain detailed information in order to set ambitious goals and targets, above all, it should be expressed in a simple and clear manner. Because GBF is aimed at all biodiversity stakeholders' participation, the content of all goals and targets must be presented in a perspicuous manner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Republic of Korea. I will now give the floor to Malaysia, followed by Bhutan, and then Guatemala. Malaysia, you have the floor. Please go ahead, Malaysia. I can see that your microphone is activated from my hand. Okay, so perhaps I'll ask the technical service to work with Malaysia to fix connection, and then we'll come back to Malaysia in a couple minutes. Let's now move to Bhutan, followed by Guatemala and Costa Rica. Bhutan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Bhutan would like to acknowledge everyone who has contributed towards the development of the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and we thank you for your efforts. During the informal sessions earlier this year, Bhutan has stressed that the framework does not adequately address already existing commitments. However, we have noted that the first draft still does not address maintaining existing efforts, which is equally important in achieving the goals set out in the framework. Therefore, Bhutan would like to see that, going forward, the framework recognizes and incorporates the requirements of maintaining existing commitments that will not only bring on board the global efforts, but most importantly, contribute to the overall targets, especially on the protected areas. There is also a requirement to recognize and support countries that have made such commitments to conserve and manage their biodiversity in order to encourage them to continue doing so. In most developing countries, and especially the least developed countries like Bhutan, data for both species and genetic diversity are still largely unavailable due to capacity and financial constraints. This lack of baseline data will prove to be a challenge when the framework requires reporting towards a rate of increase or decrease in particular targets and towards the headline indicators. The targets have not provided any avenues for exploring and discovering new species, nor on strengthening data and information on existing species and genetic diversity in countries that have so far not been able to do so. This is a critical requirement, especially for countries like Bhutan, if we are to progress forward and to successfully implement the framework. There has to be dedicated targets to help countries set up baseline for effective implementation of the framework. With regard to the means of implementation in terms of finance, capacity, and technology, there needs to be clarity on equitable distribution of support and continued support for countries that have already a high level of ambition in terms of conservation efforts. This will encourage these countries to continue their conservation efforts. Further, Bhutan also has limited capacity and limited information in understanding DSI and could benefit from capacity building initiatives, technology support, and knowledge transfer. On particular specifics, we will make our interventions during the contact group, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhutan. I understand Malaysia is now ready to make their intervention, so please give the floor to Malaysia. We will be followed by Guatemala and Costa Rica. Malaysia, you have the floor. Malaysia,
Hello.
we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And distinguished delegates, Malaysia appreciates the hard work of the two co-chairs in producing the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Malaysia considers the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as an improvement from the zero draft and look forward to discussions in the coming 2 weeks. At Substar 24, Malaysia called for an ambitious and implementable post-2020 GBF. At OEWG3, we would like to echo this call, especially highlighting the needs of targets that can be easily integrated into respective national frameworks or NBSEPs without a prolonged and resource-intensive review process. For the post-2020 GBF to be effectively mainstreamed, the goals, milestones, and targets to be agreed upon must be realistic, comparable, and transferable across national, state, and local jurisdictions. At this point, we must express our concern of this first draft. Equally, Malaysia is concerned about the indicators developed to measure the multitude of goals, milestones, and targets. While we understand that one indicator cannot possibly paint the entire picture of a country's achievement, we call for greater emphasis to be placed on developing indicators that leverage upon existing data collection, analysis, and reporting methods. Should such data be unavailable, Malaysia stresses the need for technical and financial support to collect this information at the local level. We request that guidance documents technical assistance and adequate financial resources from the Secretariat and developed countries be provided for this purpose. At OEWG3, we will also be discussing DSI. It remains our position that DSI must be integrated into the post-2020 GBF. We hope that all our hard work and late nights as a member of the Asia Pacific Bloc in the upcoming online sessions will be fruitful. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Malaysia. And yes, we do recognize the hardship for your region. So let's now move on to Guatemala, followed by Costa Rica and Argentina. Guatemala, tiene la palabra.
Have the floor. Thank you, Chair. Guatemala very much supports what was said by Argentina on behalf of the GRULAC group. We welcome the inclusion of Target 2 specifically on restoration. We also very much support Targets 3 and 4 on protected areas, conservation of species and genetic diversity, as well as Target 19 on the increase of resource mobilization from all sources, as well as Targets 20 and 21 on informed decision-making and ensuring the full and effective participation of IPLCs, women and youth in decision-making on biodiversity inter alia. Turning to Target 5, Guatemala considers that it's important to take account of customary sustainable use and the rights of IPLCs related to the use of biodiversity. On Target 17, it's important that we clarify the implementation context for this target on LMOs, and that doesn't apply to the whole scope of application of biotechnology. Then finally, on Target 1, on ensuring that the whole area is under integrated spatial planning, and then Target 7 on reducing pollution from all sources, as well as Target 10 ensuring that all areas under agriculture, aquaculture and forestry are managed sustainably, increasing the productivity and resilience of these production systems, and also Target 15 saying that all businesses should assess and report on their dependencies and impacts on biodiversity, does not actually clarify to which sectors we're referring, and they're highly ambitious targets, which means that at a national level it's very difficult to implement these in the way in which they're currently drafted. Therefore, Guatemala will be making comments and suggestions so that we can have an ambitious post-2020 GBF, which is also realistic and relevant and is consistent with the proposed theory of change that we find in the first draft of the post-2020 GBF to stabilize by 2030 the trends that have exacerbated loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Finally, Co-Chair, Guatemala pleads in favour of a simpler language for the post-2020 GBF so that each sector that's involved, governments, academia, the private sector, Indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth, amongst others, to be able to promote its full implementation. Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Thank you very much, Guatemala.
By Argentina and Mexico. Costa Rica tiene la palabra.
Costa Rica. And the interpreter points out we do not have a text for Costa Rica. Thank you, Co-Chair. First of all, we would like to thank you for your efforts and the efforts of the Secretariat in preparing the document for this meeting. Costa Rica would like to highlight certain elements in the decision 1434, the COP committed to coming up with a transformative strategic framework. However, we consider that we have not yet achieved this change. We need to change our traditional paradigms, and so we need to make big efforts so that we can strike a right balance between the different goals. In the first draft, it's evident that we've got robust targets to reduce threats, but in the group of targets when it comes to meeting people's needs and also tools to implement, there's still work that needs to be done on all of this. there needs to be specific effort when it comes to having a more effective implementation of the theory of a change so that relations between the targets and the goals are clearer, and that would help us to identify more clearly the goals that are the most objective in order to transform the economic, social and financial models that exacerbate loss of biodiversity. And we have to review the role of the milestones. That's a cause for concern. Costa Rica believes that the milestones are not actually contributing, but are actually confusing the concepts between goals and targets. So co-chair as co-president of the High Level Ambition Coalition very much supports Target 3 on 30 by 30. And according to scientific evidence, it would be essential to do this to turn back the loss of biodiversity and to be able to bring benefits to people. Specifically, my country welcomes the inclusion of the qualitative aspects under Target 3 based on IHE Target 11. We consider that we can make certain amendments to the language to make it clearer between the goals and the targets, and these are proposals that we will share during the discussions in the contact groups. Finally, we would like to see more clarity in terms of having specific targets for traditional knowledge of the IPLCs and the role of youth, women, and the most vulnerable populations. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Upload your statement. That would be much appreciated. I will now turn for the last statements before the break, and after with Argentina, and after the break we'll turn to Mexico and Ecuador. Argentina, tienes la palabra.
The floor, Argentina. Again, we do not have this text. Thank you very much, Co-Chair. In 1992, our countries met in Rio de Janeiro and agreed on a convention in order to halt the loss of biodiversity on the planet. And we created a wise and well-balanced document. We set out 3 objectives, namely to conserve biodiversity and use it sustainably, and also to have fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from this. And we also drew up a plan to fulfill these objectives. And each party had to put forward their NBSAP, their national strategy, and collaborate to implement this and take account of common but differentiated responsibilities between developing countries on the one hand and developed countries on the other hand. Distinguished delegates, almost 3 decades on, we have this challenge to strengthen these elements so that we can reflect the intelligent balance that we found back in 1992. In order to achieve this, Argentina thinks that it's necessary to make 4 big changes. First of all, the framework has to be simple and clear. So we think that in this meeting, we should reach consensus on the structure. And we suggest that Goal A should become an aspirational one and assimilate it with the drafting that we find in the rest of the goals. And we also think we should eliminate the milestones and integrate some of these elements into the targets. Finally, we also think that we have to rethink the correlation between the targets and the goals. And secondly, we need to have a balance in the framework between the conservation targets and sustainable use targets, and also the ABS targets. We also need to reach a balanced between targets to halt biodiversity and have new and additional financial resources which will allow developing countries to act in line with Article 20 of the Convention. Thirdly, the framework has to have a human rights-based approach. In this respect, Argentina defends and will defend a framework that will promote the participation in environmental issues which recognise the special role played by IPLCs as custodians of biodiversity and guarantees the security of defenders of human rights dealing with environmental issues, and will in particular protect human rights of women, children and youth. Finally, and successful framework should contribute to sustainable recovery and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. This means that we have to promote a just transition towards production and sustainable consumption models that will guarantee food security and harness new technologies to conserve and use in a sustainable way biodiversity, and also ensure the provision of ecosystem services and resolve the increasing gaps between developed and developing countries. By way of conclusion, Argentina will actively participate in the discussions this week with the aim to contribute to a GBF that will promote a society that lives in harmony with nature and that does not leave anyone behind. Thank you very much, Co-Chair. Thank you very much to Argentina for that.
Now take a break for 15 minutes and we'll be resuming at 9 o'clock sharp. Thank you very much.
Please don't log off or put your hands down, because the queue will remain. We have to maintain the queue, and so please do that. Don't either log off or put your hand down. Thank you. Hi, co-chairs. I think you can start. Thank you.
Okay, dear delegates, I hope I'm able to be clear and also the network could be reliable. Do you hear me, co-chair? Okay, so thank you very much, and apologies for the network. It has been bad, but I think where I am now, there's a possibility it could be stable. So in terms of speakers now, I have Jordan, which will be followed by Mexico and Colombia. That is what is on my screen. So if the moderator could give the floor to Jordan, please. Microphone to Jordan. Yes, I see. Yes. Okay, I think Jordan is having some challenges. Let me take Mexico. It will be followed by Colombia. Mexico. The floor could be given to Mexico, please.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, co-chair. Mexico very much supports what's been said by GRULAC, and we'd just like to mention certain points on the first draft of the post-2020 GBF. First of all, the structure continues to be confusing. The goals, targets, and milestones are not linked up nor nested in each other and show some repetitive elements. Clarity is needed to implement tracking and monitoring processes and to enable optimal communication of the post-2020 GBF. Secondly, we request that the Secretariat and co-chairs clarify through the production of a document the origin or source of the percentages and figures that are indicated in the goals and in some targets. Thirdly, we suggest that the goal should be drafted in an aspirational way. Therefore, the percentage and figures indicated in Goal A should be removed. Fourthly, we repeat the need to remove milestones because they do not bring added value to the instrument. They make it more difficult to track it, and they were not considered in the monitoring framework. We suggest that some of the milestone elements could be included in the targets. Fifthly, we appreciate the restoration target as well as the elements related to genetic diversity. However, we do not think that they're very realistic, especially as regards the percentages that have been set. Sixthly, we appreciate the inclusion of traditional knowledge and urge that we should point out that IPLCs as holders of traditional knowledge are the ones that should give their free, prior and informed consent as regards access to their genetic resources and associated information, as well as their full and effective participation in the whole process. Number 7, we welcome the rights-based approach as a cross-cutting access in implementation of the framework for effective conservation of biodiversity and protection of biocultural wealth. Number 8, we reiterate the need to develop all of the headline indicators. We'd like to point out that out of the 39 indicators that have been contemplated, we still need to further develop 11 of these. Point 9 now. As regards implementation means we need to consider strong participation and political involvement, as well as an increase in financial resources from all sources and appropriate legislation, as well as the transfer and exchange of knowledge and technologies. Number 10, we consider that sections E to H of the document need to be reviewed, and there needs to be more details added. Point 11, given the limited time and the vast number of subjects related to the post-2020 framework, we suggest that we should prioritise the discussions to agreeing on the goals and targets. And finally, we do have some drafting suggestions on various elements in the framework and also on the draft recommendation, and we will send these in to the Secretariat. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Thank you, Mexico. Now give the floor to Colombia, followed by Chile.
Gracias, señor copresidente.
Thank you, Co-Chair. and we support what has been said by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC. And we'd like to thank you for the first draft of the global framework, which is a good basis for negotiations. However, Colombia does have certain comments to make. First of all, the structure of the framework is complex. We recognise the efforts that have been made to develop a nested approach, but we however, like to point out that the interrelation between goals and targets could actually pose a challenge for disseminating the framework and for mobilising high-level decision makers. Secondly, the proposed framework should recognise the role of the production sectors and individuals to address the drivers of direct and indirect biodiversity loss. Thirdly, the theory of change should reflect the different dimensions of biodiversity loss and maintain a comprehensive and holistic approach. Then on the mission and in line with the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, we suggest that we should revert the loss of biodiversity by the year 2030, which will imply taking transformative action under the 3 objectives of the Convention and in partnership with all of the productive sectors and relevant stakeholders. Fifthly, on the milestones, Colombia would like to reiterate that their inclusion under the goals causes duplication with certain targets and indicators. We suggest that some of the elements of the milestones could be moved to targets and or headline indicators. We have to bear in mind the fragility of the baselines and development of indicators for appropriate implementation thereof, so that it would actually increase transparency and accountability at national and international level in terms of progress and implementation of the framework. Then the targets will express more details in the contact group. However, thank you. So, on the targets, we will express our comments in detail in the contact group. However, we support the inclusion of a target on restoration, and we call on adoption of this target for the conservation of 30% of land areas and sea areas of the planet by 2030. We also note with great concern that the nature-based solution language was removed and is not even mentioned in the glossary. We have to recall the situation we've all gone through with COVID-19, and the relation between human beings and nature is undeniable. Then 7, on the implementation mechanism section, Colombia agrees with the approach put forward by the co-chairs, namely these subjects should be updated in the draft once they have been agreed upon. However, Colombia is very concerned that we don't have key elements such as intergenerational equity and mainstreaming, and we've weakened the need to prevent zoonotic diseases and pandemics. So we would ask for these elements to be reintroduced into the text. We consider them to be strategic. There's also an important gap in the framework regarding generation of synergies. A key element related to the ambition of the framework consists in mobilising efforts beyond the CBD and strengthening the role of multilateral environmental agreements. So please, co-chairs and colleagues, we have to take account of the situation that we're all living through, and so we need to move from words to action. And finally, we will send in our comments in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colombia. Now, next I have the following list of speakers. There is Chile, Norway, Uganda, Algeria, and Iran. So the floor is now given to Chile, please. Chile, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, co-chair. Chile appreciates the publication of the first draft of the Post-2020 GBF, which constitutes an important step towards its adoption. And we also support what's been said by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC, and also what's been said by Costa Rica, Mexico, and Colombia. Through different multilateral fora and high-level events, Chile is committed to highlighting the crucial importance of protecting and conserving the ocean and nature's contribution to people, including ecosystem functions and services. In this respect, while welcoming the new and improved references to the ocean in Target 3 and to aquaculture in Target 10, we wish to reiterate our call for a more comprehensive inclusion of ocean and marine aspects throughout the GBF, as well as for progress to be made in improving the quality of ocean conservation by implementing a network of highly and fully protected marine areas. This new draft reflects many of the comments made by parties and shows the progress made compared to previous versions. However, we still have some comments to make, and we hope we'll be able to deal with this in more depth at the contact groups. In our view, the first draft lacks structural clarity and cohesion between the different sections of the GBF. We strongly suggest adding the concept of planetary boundaries or limits related to the theory of change. We reiterate that there should be clear consistency between the three objectives of the Convention, the 2050 vision, and the GBF's goals, targets, and means of implementation. As it stands, we do not see the value of the milestones and think, in fact, they could be removed. Also, we think that the goals should not include a quantitative dimension, whereas all targets should include measurable figures that are clearly accompanied by scientific evidence-based explanations. We also believe that implementation, transparency, and outreach efforts are crucial elements to achieve successful results. Therefore, we propose that sections H to K, which are currently very succinct, could be further developed with some more details. Regarding now the monitoring framework and considering the lessons learned from past experiences and the non-attainment of Aichi targets, Chile is concerned about the absence of clear baselines and the considerable number of indicators that still need to be finalized. Therefore, we believe that a set of headline indicators should be prioritized and adopted alongside the GBF at the face-to-face segment of COP15, within the context of a global crisis in which scientific evidence again and again is urging us to take immediate transformative action. Our country remains committed to the adoption of an ambitious, attainable, and easily understandable post-2020 GBF. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll give the floor to Norway, followed by Uganda. Norway.
Thank you, Chair. Norway thanks the co-chairs for providing us with the first draft of the GBF. This is a good starting point for our discussions, and we will present some overall observations. Among the strengths, we note the following: significant structural improvements on the link between goals and milestones. Interlinkages between the goals and targets levels under Goal A are now logical and coherent. We're pleased that the text referring to Indigenous peoples and their participation and contribution has been significantly strengthened. We welcome the qualitative elements introduced under Target 3 and that the target will be implemented through protected areas and OECMs. We also welcome a standalone target on restoration. There are also several weak elements that we see need for improvement. Strengthened mechanisms for implementation is key to ensure an effective GBF. Progress was made during SBI 3, and we are disappointed that the draft have left out key elements discussed. We would prefer to see the following elements reflected in the framework. Revision of MBSAPs in line with the goals and targets of the new GBF should be the first step following the adoption of the GBF. National reports should provide information on how national efforts are contributing to the global goals and targets. We need a cyclical process to track the collective progress towards the objectives of the GBF, a global stocktake. Insights provided by the global stocktake should then inform adjustments of MBSAPs. The sustainable use dimension needs to be strengthened. An ambitious target on conservation will not change the fact that most of biodiversity will still be outside of protected areas. As stated, we note there is good coherence between goals and targets under Goal A. This link is significantly weaker under Goal B. We consider mainstreaming as a necessary approach and suggest this be included under Goal B. The revised goals and targets on resource mobilization must be evidence-based and built on the recommendation from the expert group on finance for nature. We would like to underline that states must respect existing human rights obligations when implementing the GBF, and would like to see text in the framework to this end. We see the need for a preamble or introduction to the framework that should address relevant cross-cutting issues that do not warrant separate goals and targets. Lastly, we underline the importance of allocating sufficient time for interventions from non-state parties, Indigenous communities, and NGOs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Norway. I have now Uganda. I'll be followed by Algeria. Uganda, you have the floor.
Hello. Can you, co-chair, confirm if you can hear me?
Yes, I can, please. I can.
Co-chair, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Do you hear me? Jyoti, do you hear Uganda? Jyoti.
I can hear both of you. I can
Yes,
hear
go ahead.
Uganda
Raise your
and
hand if you can hear me. If you can't hear me,
we can hear you.
okay.
It's
Thank
like
you,
this.
co-chair.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm having difficulties with the audio at this end, but anyway, thank you so much. Uganda aligns with the statement made by DRC, speaking on behalf of the Africa Group. Uganda wishes to congratulate the co-chairs of the Open-Ended Working Group for the extensive effort in preparing the first draft of the post-2020 GBF. We view this version of the document as substantially improved iteration. Nonetheless, it is still work in progress, and this meeting, therefore, is an excellent opportunity to give additional guidance to the co-chairs to further refine the content of the framework. In this regard, Uganda wishes to highlight the following general observations. One, the causality relationship between the 2030 and the 2050 elements of the framework needs to be further strengthened, and also to ensure that the required level of ambition consistently runs through as a common thread. Two, the goals and targets are loaded with several issues and have therefore become less smart. The revision of this draft will need to strike a balance between action-oriented and outcome-oriented targets that are smart and easy to communicate. Three, we recommend incorporation of some direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss that are particularly concerning, not just for Uganda, but for many in Africa, namely unsustainable population growth, natural disasters, armed conflicts, global trade and resource demand, among others. Four, we are pleased to note that resource mobilization issues have received attention in a goal and target of their own. However, Uganda feels that the identified resource package should be revised upwards to ensure adequate alignment with the level of ambition required for transformative change. Five, the sections on implementation arrangements are very brief and they fail to demonstrate a seamless approach for effective and timely delivery of the framework. This section should therefore be elaborated further and also ensure that their respective arrangements are adopted together with the framework as one consolidated package. Finally, co-chair, we look forward to providing concrete suggestions on the content of the draft when we convene in contact groups. Thank you, co-chair.
Thank you, Uganda. I think we were able to pick you throughout your submission. Now I'll have Algeria, and then it will be followed by China, Algeria. Floor to Algeria, please. I see Algeria has gone off the screen, so maybe China. If you could give the floor to China, as Algeria could try to get back. China, could give the floor to China. Hello? I don't see those secretariat able to connect China. Jyoti, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Moderators, could you give the floor to either Algeria or China, either of the two? Neither of them, they both have their hands raised, but they haven't been given the floor. Thank you. China has the floor now.
Yes, okay.
Thank you.
China, you have the floor. Maybe we get back to China again. They might be having technical problems. In the meantime, let me go to UK, then I'll come back to Algeria and China. UK, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. The United Kingdom is committed to supporting ambitious global action to bend the curve of biodiversity loss by 2030. We welcome, therefore, the publication of the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which forms a good basis for discussion. We are particularly pleased to see a strengthened 30 by 30 target, which better recognises the importance of ensuring the quality of protected areas and OECMs. The highly ambitious goals and targets for species and ecosystems, including genetic diversity, and the stretching targets on the resources necessary to deliver these ambitions. However, the UK feels that the draft continues to lack a
Hello, have we lost UK?
No, they're back.
Okay, UK, hello to UK. UK, in case you're hearing me, you have the floor. Okay, looks there's a challenge there as well. We could leave UK for now, come back to them again. UK, maybe let's try if China is back.
UK is back. UK is
Okay,
back.
UK, you have the floor. So I think we are still having problem with the UK. Yeah, UK.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Apologies. My colleague has fallen from the system, so I was going to continue for the UK, if that's okay. Continuing the intervention from the UK feels that the draft continues to lack a simple, clear message about the critical importance of urgently transitioning whole societies and economies to being nature positive. This lack could prevent the draft from resonating with the general public and policymakers. In many places, the draft has also become more complex, which carries a similar risk. There are also some significant omissions. We are concerned, for example, that there is no reference to nature-based solutions, tools which we consider as critical to tackling the joint biodiversity and climate crises together. We think that the links between biodiversity and health, including the use of the One Health approach, are not fully addressed. And to ensure that meaningful action is taken throughout the 2020s, we will need to ensure that proper attention is given to discussions on planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. This includes consideration of how the goals and targets will be measured and reported against at global and national levels. And we have already submitted proposals for an approach to clustering goals and targets and reducing the overall number of indicators. Throughout the coming days, the UK will suggest amendments to address the gaps we have identified and to simplify the framework. At all times, we are working in pursuit of an agreement that is based on the latest cutting-edge and globally endorsed scientific evidence, an agreement that is unavoidably direct in the urgency and clarity of its call to action, and an agreement that is underpinned by a truly stretching level of ambition, an ambition whose scale is matched only by the scale and profundity of the biodiversity crisis itself. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, UK. I'd just like to confirm whether now we can China, Algeria, or Iran, if they can take the floor, any one of them. China, is China back? I don't see Algeria either.
China
Iran.
has
Okay,
been given the floor. Yeah.
China, you have the floor. China, we can't hear you in case you're speaking. Okay, let me give the floor to Australia. Again, we shall get back to China. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Australia would like to thank the Secretariat and the co-chairs for their work in developing the first draft of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Australia welcomes the updated draft as an important step towards adopting a transformative and ambitious biodiversity agenda for the next decade. Overall, we think this draft is an improvement, but we believe there are opportunities to strengthen the framework so that it provides a basis for strong global action on biodiversity. Australia supports greater representation of marine and coastal biodiversity throughout the framework, recognising the unique challenges facing our marine ecosystems. As an example, we see an opportunity for sustainable fisheries management to be explicitly addressed. Australia welcomes a global target for the protection of 30% of land and 30% of sea by 2030. We support the focus in this target on areas important for biodiversity and through a combination of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. Australia also recognises that Indigenous peoples and local communities must be full partners in the implementation of this target. As a megadiverse island nation, Australia welcomes an ambitious target on managing invasive alien species. We note the importance of managing priority invasive species in areas of high biodiversity value and would like to encourage cooperation from all parties to commit to pre-border measures that prevent the transmission of species through trade and transport. Pre-border measures are far more cost-effective than managing the impacts of established invasive species. We are pleased to see an emphasis on improving sustainable production and consumption, including through circular economy values. We see opportunities to strengthen the framework by ensuring language on waste and chemical management is clear, maintains a focus on minimising harmful impacts, and doesn't create perverse outcomes. Australia commends the co-chairs on steps taken to recognise the significant contributions from business and industry. We think, however, that there are opportunities for improvement to ensure the effective and equitable participation of women and girls, gender diverse people, and younger generations. We commend the co-chairs on improving the recognition of IPLCs, and we see further opportunities to strengthen this in the framework. With 80% of the world's remaining forest biodiversity under management by IPLCs, the draft 2030 milestones and 2050 goals cannot be achieved without the equitable participation of IPLCs. The unique contribution of traditional ecological knowledge, practices and innovations to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity needs to be recognised as a cross-cutting element of the framework. We look forward to participating in the conversations during the course of this meeting and in the lead up to COP15. Thank you.
Take the floor.
Francis, I think you'll have to repeat it.
Okay, sorry. I'll give now the floor to, thank you first of all to Australia. I'll now give the floor to Cuba, followed by Jordan. Cuba. Okay, maybe as we wait for Cuba, Jordan, Cuba, you don't have the floor. Cuba, you have the floor.
My question. Can you hear me? Asks Cuba. Yes. Good evening, or good day, or good morning, depending on your time zone in connecting to this important meeting on the problems that have an impact on the current state of biodiversity. Our delegation very much would like to support the statement made by Argentina on behalf of the GRULAC group. And so in our statement, we're just going to concentrate on a few specific aspects. The 2050 goals from a methodological point of view need to be used to structure and organize the targets throughout the GBF for post-2020. There needs to be a strong link between all of these. They need to be aimed at aspirational purposes, and then they need to be explicitly laid out and linked up with the 3 conventions of the CBD, as well as the means of implementation. And we need to have a balanced reflection of the 3 objectives of the convention, because many developing countries, such as Cuba, have joined up the convention so that we'd have a more solid basis for our sustainable development. Given this, the new framework has to be clearer and give more continuity to the decisions taken on biosafety and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilisation of genetic resources that were adopted in former COP and MOP, so that we can have a possibility to work on our implementation according to our possibilities. And then we have to look at the means of implementation and the roles to be assumed by countries and regions that have been very much affected by degradation of our ecosystem. We're very concerned to see how certain parties are not referring to the Rio principles and other related environmental fora, or are not referring to certain articles of the convention that refer to all of this, and which we also have to comply with. We believe that the new framework should make these references that we have favourable conditions to show justice to past and current generations, and also look to future generations as we move towards full implementations. There are 38 headline indicators that have been indicated so far, but they don't always go to the essence of the goal in question, and around 25% of these headline indicators still need to be further researched and developed. So from a practical point of view, we've got targets in the GBF where in fact there's not yet monitoring and measurement clarity. On the headline indicators, we have to recognise that with global indicators, there's not always a match with what's happening in the countries and what's happening in multilateral organizations who are the guarantees of this information. Sometimes there's not a matching up of the methodologies that used. Cuba would like to emphasize that we will participate actively in the exchanges in the program. We know that there's a long path to reach positive results in COP15. We need to take account of the current state of biodiversity, and we need to create better conditions to address or reduce or cancel the effects of the pandemic on our societies, including natural resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cuba. I'll now like to give the floor to Jordan. If Jordan is there, that will be followed by China. I also have Philippines and India. Jordan, now you have the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية أتقدم بالشكر للأمانة والرئيسان المشاركان على إعداد هذه الوثيقة. الزملاء الأعزاء.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the Secretariat and the 2 co-chairs for preparing the document. Ladies and gentlemen, during the past stages in which the framework and follow-up on the framework were discussed in terms of content development through the draft presented to us. And these require discussion within the contact groups to consider the possibility of achieving them, whether long or short term. We also lack a baseline or a reference to the current situation to be built upon, whether at the national or international level. For example, when talking about basic milestone A and goal number 1, but achieving a net gain in the area, interconnectedness, and integrity of natural systems by at least 5%, it needs to be clarified that at the global or national level, this needs to be a measurable level. And also we require a baseline or a current reference level. Ladies and gentlemen, measurable indicators based on a clear and agreed baseline. I think we can agree that it is important to have indicators to implement progress and to guarantee sustainability of biodiversity. We need to work within the framework as a framework to concert our efforts, including those in capacity building. As for procedural goal number 3, we find that conservation of 30% of land and marine areas is defined at the global level and is linked to measuring effectiveness and management. This is an advanced model for implementing Aichi target number 11. Now, through the United Nations Environmental Assembly, there will be a ministerial conference to discuss marine waste and plastic pollution linked to goal number 7. And we hope that the outcomes will be specific from this meeting. I would also like to highlight that the indicators in goal 7 on the use of coastal nutrients and the use of pesticides are linked with goal 9 and 10. And we believe it is essential to have measures to provide incentives for organic agriculture in line with reducing use of pesticides and to ensure the integrity of ecosystems and to achieve food security. It is also necessary to have a financial mechanism for mobilizing resources in a harmonious fashion. This requires detailed information, particularly as developing countries face difficult economic challenges that have become even more difficult as a result of the pandemic. Therefore, results should be made to fund through the Green Climate Fund. And I'm sorry that I went over the time limit. I will provide my comments on the goals that remain to be covered in writing. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Delegates, I think we are beginning to go a little bit over the time of 3 minutes. That has implication on our work. So if we could still keep within the 3 minutes, that would be great. Now, I'll want to give the floor to China. Is China back by any chance? If not, then I'll give the floor to Philippines, followed by India. Philippines, China, I see China there. Is China able to speak now? I think they have connectivity problem. So let's give the floor to Philippines. If they are able to take the floor, Philippines. As we wait for Philippines. Yes,
Okay, thank you.
Philippines. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Co-Chairs, the Philippines, speaking on behalf of the 10 member states of the ASEAN sub-region, expresses our deep appreciation for your unrelenting hard work in producing the draft 1.0 of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We'd also thank the both of you co-chairs for your constant availability for briefings that we were organized in the region with support of the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity to discuss the emerging text of the post-2020 GBF. The third ASEAN Conference on Biodiversity, or the ACB 2020, a series of meetings hosted by Malaysia from September last year to July this year, provided opportunities for the ASEAN member states to gather and consolidate our positions, which we hope would be considered in the finalization of the text of this new framework. At the ECB 2020, it was expressed that the post-2020 GBF should be symbolized our shared goal of including biodiversity on our path to recovery from the pandemic. The region highlights the call of ambitious yet realistic targets and indicators with due consideration of the national circumstances in light of our respective and collective efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19 and its emerging variants and to recover of its devastating impacts. It is for these reasons that the ASEAN sub-region emphasizes the importance of Target 19 since the full and effective implementation of the post-2020 GBF requires mechanism and critical actions for resource mobilization to ensure the substantive delivery of funds and other resources to all CBD parties, especially the developing country parties. Another target of importance to the sub-region is Target 14 on mainstreaming biodiversity across sectors. The ASEAN highlights cross-sectoral cooperations in biodiversity mainstreaming, including in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, energy, mining, water, manufacturing, infrastructure, and tourism, and the need for support to these mainstreaming efforts. Interlinked with mainstreaming is the significance of Target 15, through which the ASEAN recognizes the fundamental role of the businesses play in the implementation of post-2020 GVF as we implement circular economy practices together and strengthen environmental social governance. Finally, the ASEAN sub-region underscores the importance of Target 21 as it articulates that the development of the post-2020 GBF must be participatory and inclusive of indigenous peoples and local communities, the private sector, women, and the youth, particularly in coordinating efforts to meet the proposed goal and targets of the post-2020 GBF. It is important to enable the equitable and effective participation of various stakeholders and facilitate partnerships by strengthening the role of subnational and national governments and sub-regional and regional cooperation through commensurate
Philippines,
mechanisms.
Philippines, you need to wind up.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, esteemed co-chairs. That's all.
Okay, okay, thank you, Philippines. Do I have India now ready to take the floor? India? Maybe not yet. We
Yes.
could now. Oh yeah, India, you have the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. India would like to thank the CBD Secretariat, the co-chairs, and the experts for presenting an excellent version of the draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We feel that the post-2020 framework would further help in building coherence with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and linkages with the Paris Climate Agreement, the UNCCD land degradation neutrality goals, the UN Strategic Plan for Forests, and also the Ramsar Strategic Plan. We also feel that the experience gained in achieving the Aichi biodiversity targets has to be duly considered while developing the futuristic targets, which have to be smart and should address all three objectives of the convention in a balanced manner. I am very pleased to say that India has taken an initiative to ban the manufacture and sale of single-use plastics from 1st July 2022 and has also decided to phase out the use of ozone-depleting gases in the cooling industry and has also ratified the Kigali Amendment for the Montreal Protocol. India would strongly urge to integrate the means of implementation and resource mobilization in the GBF, which must include provision for financing biodiversity actions, scientific and technical cooperation, technology transfer, since these have been considered to be the major obstacle so far in achieving the biodiversity targets. There must also be a specific benefit sharing arrangement from the commercial and non-commercial use of digital sequencing information on genetic resources with a provision to treat the non-commercial use of DSI differentially. Chairman, India is currently the president of two conventions, the CMS and the CCD, which are both very closely related to biodiversity conservation. The CMS declaration also calls for inclusion in the framework the role of various biodiversity-related conventions as well as other MEAs. India is finally of the view that perhaps more clarity is required while reporting the goals, targets, and complementary indicators. Thank you, Chair, for providing this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, India. China, we will give you the floor when you're able to speak. Now I'll give the floor to Bolivia. Sorry, Bolivia, just hang on a minute. I see China again there. China? Honestly, I think China has technical problems there. Let's give the floor now to Bolivia. Then we get back to China. Bolivia. Moderator, if you could give the floor to Bolivia. I don't know whether the moderator is able to give the floor to Bolivia. Okay, as we wait for that to happen, then I will give the floor to Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, for giving me the floor. The Côte d'Ivoire supports the statement by the DRC on behalf of the African region. We would like to commend the quality of the documentation that has been, the document that has been provided to us, and the fact that environmental issues are taken into account so deeply in order to preserve biodiversity. Côte d'Ivoire believes that the theory of change is a clear way to show the set of important factors that need to be put in place in order to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. Nonetheless, Côte d'Ivoire states that at this point, there are still milestones and targets that are not yet SMART as desired by the parties. The interpreter would also like to say that the sound is not very good. Côte d'Ivoire notes that the theory of change which supports the post-2020 framework is a clear presentation of the set of fundamental principles that must be taken into account to attain the objective, which is to reverse the loss of biodiversity. Nonetheless, Côte d'Ivoire would like to state that at present, there are still milestones and targets and goals that are not yet SMART as desired by the parties, and even less so, this applies to the indicators for evaluating them all. Nonetheless, we note that the 4 objectives of the framework are not specific enough in how they address the issues of biodiversity as we would like. This can be seen in goal B. It would be advisable to create a SMART objective for biodiversity. Côte d'Ivoire would like also to speak to the support needed by the developing countries and the requirements of those countries in order to implement the framework Unfortunately, the private sector, which was identified as a source of funding for implementation of the framework, is not indicated in the elements of a mechanism for implementation. And on that, I would like to thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Cote d'Ivoire. You still had challenges, but you even managed to keep the time. So now I would like to give the floor to Peru, followed by Senegal. Peru.
Muy buenos días.
Very good day to the co-chairs and also distinguished delegates. Peru supports the declaration made by Argentina on behalf of GRULAC, and as a mega-diverse country, Peru is committed to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity within the context of sustainable development. We wish to highlight the important role played by Indigenous peoples and local communities in the conservation and the customary management of wildlife and also the ecosystem management ventures. In this meeting, we are urging parties to aim for ambitious post-2020 goals and targets, which will enable us to reverse the loss of biodiversity and make a significant contribution to the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030, and also to promote synergies between the multilateral environmental agreements, optimizing resources and increasing effectiveness. We're aware of the fact that the world needs to undergo a transformative change when it comes to current economic, social, and financial models in order to achieve the 2050 vision for biodiversity of living in harmony with nature. On the goals that we will review in this meeting, we appreciate the urgency to enhance the integrative management of ecosystems, strengthening connectivity with a landscape-based approach and thus contributing to the conservation of species and their genetic resources while respecting the sovereignty of each country. We believe that it's important to increase the visibility of nature's contributions as part of the ecological functions and processes related to the ecosystem services. Likewise, Peru welcomes targets 3, 5, 9, 11, 12, and 19, since they consider inter alia management aimed at promoting ecosystem connectivity and the efforts by all parties to achieve the conservation of at least 30% of the planet, as well as the need for sustainable management of ecosystems and wildlife species that are an important source of economic resources, as well as offering the means of subsistence and ensuring the well-being of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Finally, we highlight the need for commitment and cooperation between the parties in order to strengthen mobilization of financial resources, and it is vital to have the involvement of the private sector, giving priority to mega-diverse countries that are centres of origin and diversity of species that are important for global food security, as well as possessing key biodiversity areas of global importance. Thank you very much, co-chairs.
Thank you, Peru. Now I'll give the floor to Senegal.
Interpreter would also like to note that neither Côte d'Ivoire nor Senegal have provided a written statement.
Merci, Président. Est-ce que vous...
Thank you. Mr. Co-Chair, can you hear me? I will speak slowly. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. The statement will be sent afterwards. Senegal commends the Secretariat and the co-chairs and recognizes that the first draft of the global framework is a great, has shown great progress. The statement made by the African group is supported by Senegal entirely, and we would like to insist on to highlight this points. The language of the framework and its development should make sure that there are no problems with interpretation. A simple simplification of the targets and milestones and goals would make it easier to understand the framework. In fact, taken into account that the link between the milestones and the targets is difficult to establish, and it is hard to take them into account, therefore it's difficult to maintain. We would like to see the milestones and targets integrated together. We would ask the Secretary to update the framework before the Geneva meeting and give the parties an opportunity to make written contributions in the intersessional period. The framework is ambitious, and its implementation will require financial resources that are commensurate with this level of ambition. The implementation must be done at the same time as developing the framework, but unfortunately the financial resources become accessible only during the implementation. The developing countries have financial requirements, and we can give our comments during the group meetings. Thank you. The contact groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'll give the floor to Brazil. Brazil, you have the floor. Microphone to Brazil, please. Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear only there's some noise behind. If you could minimize the noise that is within. Yes, yeah. But the floor is over to you, Brazil.
Thank you. Brazil is fully committed to an ambitious GBF, one that values biodiversity and the significant ecosystem services it provides, recognizing that conservation and sustainable use are two sides of the same coin. We must bear in mind that conservation and restoration policies are not sustainable in the long term if you fail to address the complex social and economic challenges that affect our societies, in particular developing countries. Ambitious conservation and restoration targets will not be met if they're not aligned with the same level of ambition in sustainability and benefit sharing. Therefore, we remain deeply concerned with the lack of ambition regarding sustainable use and benefit sharing in the first draft. Regarding sustainable use, more emphasis must be placed on the essential role of biodiversity to support innovation and the development of bio-based products through biotechnology. We cannot afford to lose the opportunity provided by the GBF to raise awareness on the benefits of bioeconomy, which is a key tool to support the implementation of the SDGs. With respect to sustainable agriculture, we invite all parties to go a step further and allocate, as Brazil already does, at least 20% of holding areas to native or diversified vegetation. We also commit ourselves to strengthening the third pillar of the Convention. Benefit sharing is a cross-cutting issue that underpins the three blocks of targets we will discuss in the upcoming days. Consequently, we should strive to mainstream benefit sharing across the GBF and develop proposals to reduce and prevent the illegal access to genetic resources, including biopiracy, and ensure compliance with APS provisions in the private sector. In addition, it is frustrating that the first draft does not provide a robust quantitative target on benefit sharing. As regards targets on threats to biodiversity, Brazil would like to emphasize that the GBF must not encroach on the mandate of other multilateral environmental agreements. Synergies between environmental regimes should be promoted on a parity-driven basis and in a manner fully consistent with the Rio principles. Regarding Goal A and the corresponding targets, we remain convinced that the restoration objectives should be based on a fair and equitable baseline. Finally, a truly global biodiversity framework is one in which all parties have access to adequate means of implementation, in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It is thus crucial to achieve the full implementation of Articles 16, 18, 20, and 21 of the Convention, which must be clearly reflected in the GBF. Without a measurable target on technology transfer and a substantial increase in multilateral flows to developing countries, we will not achieve the transformative change we are aiming for. There can be no half ambitions, and all targets need to be measurable in a transparent manner. We hope to engage in fruitful discussions in the next weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. Now I give the floor to UAE. UAE, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. شكرا سيد الرئيس. في البداية تتقدم دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة بجزيل الشكر للرئيسين المشاركين على إعداد أول مسودة للإطار العالمي للتنوع البيولوجي لما بعد 2020. إننا في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة نؤكد حرصنا والتزامنا الراسخ بدعم مسيرة العمل البيئي المشترك والدفع بها إلى آفاق أوسع لتحقيق ما تصبو إليه دولنا والأجيال القادمة من طموحات وآمال. يرحب وفد دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة بالمسودة الحالية للإطار العالمي ونشكر جهود الجميع مقدرين
generations. I would like to thank everybody. We would like to the youngsters should be participating, and we should engage the youth in post-2020 GBF so that we can preserve and protect our planet. We have to reiterate the positive approach, covering and engaging all the stakeholders and all the sectors so that we can reduce the biodiversity loss, including the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. Therefore, we would like to focus on the overall protection of biodiversity so that we can reduce the threats that we are facing. The UAE delegation The UAE delegation welcomes the list of the milestones as well as the headline indicators for post-2020 GBF. The indicators can be easily understood, there can be measurable, and especially the effectiveness of these indicators according to a unified standard of evaluation. So far, this has not been developed, and therefore we believe that there should be a development of such mechanisms with the participation of the stakeholders, and also the sustainable development indicators should be developed. The UAE hails the co-chairs for what they have been doing to converge the different points of view, and we look forward to cooperate with you to implement the biodiversity during the coming 3 decades. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Morocco. Morocco, you have the floor. Microphone.
Oh,
Yeah, Morocco.
yeah. Yes. Well, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Morocco welcomes the first draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and commends the significant work done by the co-chairs of the working group and the executive secretary. Morocco supports the intervention as well of the DRC made on behalf of the African region. We welcome the numerous improvements and specific elements added to this first draft of the framework. This is the first time in almost a year that the language of the goals and targets has been updated. We are happy to see that the momentum has been maintained despite the pandemic. We are aware that the framework is confronted with an even more difficult context than its predecessors. The last IPCC report paints an even darker picture and pessimistic picture. Deep transformations are needed to halt the decline of biodiversity around the world. We support the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, as well as the 2030 mission. And we commend the fact that they are based on the 4 long-term goals for 2050. This is in complete harmony with the 3 convention objectives and takes into account the definition of biodiversity. We welcome the emphasis on the NBSAPs as the main driver of the implementation of the framework at the national level. Mr. Co-Chair, we believe that the framework should be a unified action plan integrating both the CBD and the global goals of biodiversity-related MAEs, which should also be updated in turn to align themselves with the new framework. This in order to facilitate integrated implementation at the national level. Morocco believes that the success of the implementation of the framework with the transformative change sought depends on investment commensurate with the need for capacity building, technology transfer, and strategic communication, particularly providing eligible countries with the necessary financial support for implementing the framework. Finally, Morocco proposes including a summary for policymakers in the framework. And more generally, we underscore the importance of developing a comprehensive communication strategy in support of the post-2020 framework. And we remind all that the implementation of the global framework should be adapted to the national context of each party to the convention. I thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and I did send my statement to the Secretariat. Have a good day.
Thank you, Morocco. China, is China now back again? I know they've been trying severally to take the floor. Yes, China. China, in case you're speaking, we are not hearing you. Dear delegates, as you can see, we have not managed to complete all the party statements that we thought would come through today. Therefore, there will be another session tomorrow where we have at least 90 minutes of plenary, and it will start again 7 a.m. Montreal time, like has always been the case. We will then hear the remaining statements from parties. We will then follow up with other governments, major stakeholder groups, and finally, as many observers as possible. We have made a note of the parties, on the list, and we will, of course, proceed as such. So we've taken note of the parties that have requested the floor, but have not been able to speak because of time factor today. Please check the website for updated information on all upcoming sessions. So with this, unless the Secretariat has some additional information, Secretariat?
No additional information except please do check the website for updated information on the contact groups that are coming up. We know that the DSI contact group that is scheduled for tomorrow will continue as scheduled, but we will inform you through the website on the first contact group on the GBF, when and how that will take place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretariat. So with that, the meeting is hereby adjourned. See you tomorrow and have a nice day, nice evening, good afternoon, whatever the time might be in your areas of jurisdiction. So see you tomorrow.